There is a kind of distance that forms without intention. No argument, no clear decision, no dramatic turning point. Messages take longer to answer. Conversations shorten. Invitations are postponed with reasonable excuses. Contact fades gradually, almost politely, and by the time it's noticed, the space is already there. People who pull away without realizing it rarely feel like they are leaving anyone. They still care. They still think about others. Nothing feels broken. The shift happens quietly, in small adjustments that feel harmless on their own. A bit less energy for conversation, a preference for staying in, a growing comfort with fewer interactions. In daily life, this shows up subtly, enjoying solitude more than expected, feeling relief when plans are canceled, needing longer recovery time after social contact. None of this feels alarming. It feels natural, necessary even. The distancing doesn't register as loss. It registers as regulation. Because there is no conflict, the mind doesn't label it as withdrawal. It feels like self-care, like simplification, like choosing peace. But the movement is still outward, a slow drift away from shared spaces, shared rhythms, shared presence. And somewhere beneath that calm adjustment, a quiet question begins to form. Not why did I leave, but when did I start disappearing without noticing? This kind of distancing is rarely driven by rejection. More often, it comes from gradual depletion. Interaction begins to cost more energy than it returns. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. The system starts conserving. Less explanation, less exposure, less engagement. The pullback isn't emotional withdrawal, it's energetic regulation. From a psychological perspective, this happens when internal load increases quietly. Responsibilities accumulate. Emotional processing deepens. Self-awareness grows. As inner complexity expands, outer contact may feel harder to sustain. The person doesn't decide to step away. Their capacity simply narrows. Connection becomes something to manage rather than enter freely. Behaviorally, this creates a pattern of soft avoidance. Replies are delayed, not ignored. Invitations are postponed, not declined outright. Presence is reduced without announcement. Because everything remains polite and reasonable, no alarm is triggered. Others may sense distance, but nothing seems wrong enough to address. Over time, this reinforces a subtle habit. Space feels stabilizing. Engagement feels effortful. The system learns that reducing contact lowers internal strain. Distance becomes the default response. Not because closeness is unwanted, but because it feels heavier than it used to. There is a point when this distancing starts to feel normal. The reduction in contact no longer registers as a change, but as the new baseline. The person adapts quickly. Fewer messages feel manageable. Longer gaps feel acceptable. The social field narrows, and the mind adjusts without protest. Nothing feels missing yet, only quieter. From a behavioral standpoint, this happens because withdrawal removes friction. Fewer interactions mean fewer emotional adjustments, fewer expectations to track, fewer roles to perform. The nervous system experiences relief. That relief becomes reinforcing. Distance isn't chosen for what it avoids, but for what it simplifies. Psychologically, this creates a feedback loop. Reduced contact lowers stimulation. Lower stimulation reduces strain. Reduced strain confirms the choice. Over time, the system begins to anticipate ease only in separation. Engagement starts to feel dense before it even begins. The body prepares for effort at the thought of connection. This is where the distancing becomes self-sustaining, not through avoidance, but through comfort. The person still values others, still feels affection, still intends to reconnect soon. But soon keeps moving. Presence is postponed gently, repeatedly, until absence feels familiar. And because nothing went wrong, it's hard to say when the drift truly started, only that at some point, the distance stopped feeling temporary. As this pattern settles, it begins to shape emotional expectations around connection. The person doesn't anticipate conflict or rejection, they anticipate effort. Being with others starts to feel like something that requires preparation, recovery, and careful pacing. Even positive interactions are filtered through the question of capacity. Do I have the energy for this right now? From a psychological perspective, this happens when self-regulation quietly replaces engagement. The system learns to prioritize internal stability over relational presence. Distance becomes the easiest way to stay balanced, not because relationships are unsafe, but because they now feel demanding in ways they didn't before. Emotionally, this creates a soft detachment. Care remains intact, but expression thins. Warmth is felt, but offered selectively. The person is not cold, they are cautious. Connection is approached gently, sometimes hesitantly, as if it could tip the internal balance. Nothing dramatic signals this shift. There is no rupture, no explicit boundary drawn. The person simply becomes less available over time.
And because availability fades gradually, it rarely feels like a loss in the moment. It feels like adaptation, like learning how to move through life with less friction. Yet beneath that adaptation, something subtle changes. Closeness becomes optional and distance becomes the default. Over time, this gradual distancing begins to influence how the person understands themselves. They may start to see themselves as someone who prefers solitude, who needs less contact, who functions better independently. This self-description feels accurate. It explains the calm, it justifies the space, and it makes the distancing feel intentional, even if it wasn't.
Psychologically, identity often adapts to behavior. When pulling away brings relief, the mind reframes it as preference, not because connection isn't valued, but because distance has become the most reliable way to regulate internal load. The person isn't rejecting others, they are organizing their world around what feels manageable. Behaviorally, this leads to subtle limits, fewer spontaneous interactions, more structured contact, relationships that survive but in reduced form. The person remains kind, responsive when needed, but rarely initiates closeness. Presence becomes conditional on capacity, not desire. Over time, this creates a quiet narrowing. Life feels calmer but also smaller, fewer shared moments, fewer emotional surprises. The protection works, internal stability is preserved, yet something begins to feel thin, not lonely but less connected than before. And slowly, a question forms beneath the calm. Is this distance chosen, or has it simply become familiar?